Hello. Today I interview Gene Kogan. Gene is, this amazing person who's thinking about, he creates all of this new AI generative art like Dall-E and Midjourney. And he's thinking at a more deep level, though, about how to create these open systems and also how they connect to open and like to collective intelligence more generally. So thinking about how these AI assistants are going to provide us with interfaces to maximize our creativity. So if you're interested in the future of artificial intelligence and the kind of environmental niches that AI is going to evolve into, especially around art, then definitely check out this episode. Thanks. Bye. Hello, fellow pluralists. My name is Rhys. I'm the co-founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. The century is a turning point in human history, and I'm here to help you navigate it. I hope you come away with a new understanding of the scientific, technological, and societal trends that are poised to radically reshape our world, and how you can work with those trends to become a live player in building a solarpunk future. And to chat about building a solarpunk future, I'm excited to chat with Gene Kogan today. Gene is an artist and programmer with interests in generative art, collective intelligence, autonomous systems, and computer science. He does a lot of those cool new Dall-E style AI art experiments. Gene, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to dive in. And I think for, both for your context and my context, I think, the goal kind of is for the listeners to understand, what is going to happen with, what does artificial intelligence and art look like in the next kind of 10 to 25 years? And also kind of like, how will these AI assistants continue to become a bigger and bigger part of our lives? So I think that's kind of what we're directioning towards. But before I want to like dive into that, I actually want to ask you, Gene, you're one of these like Twitter folks who's like interested in a lot of weird stuff. And so I guess I want to ask you, like, what was the catalyzing moment in your childhood that actually kicked off this feedback loop to make you curious and motivated about the world?
Oh wow. Well, that's a pretty hard question to start with. Maybe for the specifically for like AI and the kind of things that I'm interested in now, I would say video games probably. Like as a child, I played like different kinds of sports games on Nintendo, Super Nintendo, where I would play against the AI. And then once I got bored of beating the AI 99 nothing, I would start to watch the AI play against itself. And I was just kind of fascinated by this. I suppose it's kind of at the root of my interest in generative art too. And so I was just, simulation and things like that really appealed to me. Like I was into SimCity. That was another game that I played a lot, where I'd build these cities and then watch them kind of evolve. And so just kind of, nurtured this interest in generative, systems. And to me, generative systems and AI are very closely linked. I suppose that explains a lot of what I'm interested in within AI. But yeah, I think to answer the question succinctly, probably games.
Yeah, that's great. No, and it's amazing how much video games, I mean, for so many and for me, yeah, just thinking like, growing up playing StarCraft and then you're playing the bots and then my friends started to make some of these bots that they made their own, and so it's like, okay, now they're battling versus you. And so trying to think from its perspective is really kind of powerful and you can do it in a lot of different kind of game types. And I also just think about so amazing that the kids these days have Minecraft, like what a
Oh
great
yeah,
play space. So
yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um
I actually it's funny because I don't really play games that much now,
yeah,
and so Minecraft kind of like came, I suppose, a little bit after my time.
same.
But it is to me like large multiplayer universes feel like they're just full of so many hidden corners. It's like, if you think the world is, the human world is expansive and pluralistic, you can multiply that by 1,000 times with games, in principle. So all that stuff is definitely pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I think, and like kind of diving in on the AI piece more generally, I think that, so like, we're in this interesting moment with artificial intelligence where we've seen kind of Midjourney and Dall-E and these like, generative adversarial networks, these GANs that are kind of being able to create and generate ideas or content or whatever on the fly. How do you, it almost feels like, 2 years ago or even 6 months ago, if you would have showed people like Dall-E style or, Midjourney, people would be like, wow, that's amazing. But almost now it feels it was like optimized for Twitter feeds. It kind of spread to our Twitter feeds, and it was like, here's like all this stuff. And then now, though, I don't know. I'm left wondering. It's almost like there's too much of it. There's too much abundance. It was like this new thing. And so I'm curious what you see as like the next steps with, and specifically, let's just do AI plus art. Like, it doesn't feel like that's the end game, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. The first generation of these, sort of generative AI interfaces, they're very much kind of mostly revolve around the novelty of being able to generate images of anything that you want from text. And so, with Dall-E and Midjourney, with I've been working on this Abraham also, which has a text to image interface, and there, it's also kind of like it's very unconstrained. And I think, people, there's a funny thing that happens when you show it to people. It's like, look, you can generate anything you want from these images, and so try it out. And they might ask like, oh, well, what should I make? Anything, and then they kind of like flatline from there. And it's like you give someone a blank piece of paper, and it's like writer's block sets in immediately. And really, what people want or need are tools that help them do the things that they already do. And so I think the next step for these things is to find downstream applications to actually to so for example text to image is a very broad category. You can imagine applications in a whole bunch of different fields. If you're an architect, it could help you draft, draft blueprints and kind of designs for buildings. If you're a designer, it can help you make design assets, things like that. And I think you'll see, kind of like as you saw for language models like GPT-3 and all of that stuff, there was this kind of Cambrian explosion of different use cases for all of those things that came along after the initial novelty of the system, wore off. And you'll see them. It'll take a while to adoption will take a while, but that's kind of the next step is speciation.
That's cool. Yeah. And I love the term speciation there. That's a great term of it, where it's like, hey, we have this Cambrian explosion. And then what are the species that actually emerge? Well, there's going to be a specific species that is some kind of architect blueprint thing where they say, hey, give me, 10 designs that are going to fit this kind of, it's 100, I don't know how architects work, but like 2 stories, 100 by 100, lots of windows, whatever they say. And then it'll kind of give them some stuff. They'll choose some, and then it'll like, and so I guess there'll be like specific things for that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's in the sort of text to image domain, but then the same principle applies to audio and to text, and so those audio in particular is not quite as like mature yet as making images, but it's not far behind. And so I think you'll probably see in the future kind of audio workstations are going to have ways of producing sounds, instead of from sample packs. It's like you can produce a sound that you need for something, and maybe the interface to that is text driven. So I think, yeah, you'll see a lot more of that in all of the media.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that there's like a, and I agree, and I saw you had two tweets about both of these things recently, both of which are just like, yeah, oh my god, that's super true. And I remember seeing some of like the AI generated music, and yeah, it was okay, but it's also not. There's also a, I think when you think about these things, like what evolutionary niche will they kind of fall into? And I think that so many of the Dall-E things fell into a Twitter or Instagram base, like, okay, you can just boom, this like came in your feed. And I think music, like no one posts Spotify songs in the feed or whatever. So it'll probably be, I imagine it being something in TikTok where the TikTokers are able to create some kind like it just has to be music native. And so it's like 15 or 60-second TikTok things. Do you agree with that? Or what do you think the evolutionary niche will be for some of the sound stuff?
I think like it's harder to predict the culture that emerges around it than the actual technology. I can understand why it doesn't work as well on Twitter, because Twitter is like a very visual thing, and actually like a lot of social media in general is very sort of visually oriented. So but people do listen to music, and I think you're right that at least in TikTok, music is a big part of the culture, or sound anyway. And so yeah, maybe there's going to be ways of TikTokers, kind of like producing. I don't want to predict too much like TikTok culture because I don't follow it that much, but certainly like that as a technological capacity will be very much available to them. And so, if platforms are ready to integrate it, then I think you'll see a
Then
lot more of it.
it shall be integrated. Yeah, I think there's an interesting,
Yeah,
and I agree with what you're saying too, which is there's like kind of two forms of it. There's like the Dall-E, or like Midjourney or Abraham form, which is just like, hey, this thing exists and exists in the memes that it creates. The like mimetic outcome are these images that just like spread quickly but don't have long lasting retention. Versus these other ones, which are like, no, this is like for a thing that you're an architect and you're trying to get your job done, and so there's like a different kind of mimetic niche there. And similarly with the sound, it's like, oh, like you're saying, Ableton or these digital audio workstations, that's a different kind of mimetic niche. It's like, no, these are sample packs that people will actively use, then they're going to mess with them and as they're making them, and then they'll end up as like a 3-minute song later, but that's kind of like a different thing. So tell me how, actually I have a
yeah,
specific question, which is Abraham versus Dall-E and Midjourney. What are the fundamental differences or similarities between those systems? I know very little about it.
yeah. Abraham is a little bit like Abraham's not specifically for having text to image generation. I would consider that kind of like the real purpose behind Abraham that I've been really interested in for a long time is to make an autonomous artist. This kind of like sovereign, creative and original entity that makes art. And so Dall-E and Midjourney are more like, they're services where you can make art for yourself. And Abraham kind of looks like that right now too, because that's just kind of the state of the technology, and making an autonomous artist, at least, to satisfy my criteria for it, is still something that's a little bit science fictiony and kind of far off. And so Abraham is more this like almost like this ideal that I'm building towards. But for now, they're more the same than they are different. There's there's different dimensions we could talk about. So like, compared to Dall-E, for example, we're using open source software, so things are a little bit more out in the open, whereas Dall-E is a little bit proprietary, and so it's kind of hard to do much more than what OpenAI lets you. And then Midjourney is a little bit in between. It's also kind of in the same ecosystem that Abraham is in. We're using a lot of open models and a lot of kind of things that are a little bit more accessible. Accessible is
So,
still this kind of, you need compute, and so there's always a little bit of a catch, but it's a lot closer to that than Dall-E.
yeah, that makes sense. It's like, and so this autonomous artist idea is one. And for the listeners who aren't aware, this is like an idea. And I first heard of it with like Primavera de Filippi, who made like an
Yeah,
initial Ethereum. You have an Ethereum smart contract. It is this plantoid. You give the
right.
smart contract some ETH, and then eventually you get enough ETH to like create a physical being, this like robot that then an artist creates. And then that robot, then people are like, wow, that's a really cool piece of metal out in a Burning Man. And then people pay it more money, and then it replicates. And so similarly, you're talking about a similar thing where people pay this kind of autonomous agent, and then that thing starts to create art. It pays for the compute. Those things get sold for ETH or whatever, and then kind of ETH NFTs or whatever, and so the cycle competes. Tell me though, how when you talk about this long-term vision of it, you're like, yeah, what we have now is not at all what is like that 30 or 50-year vision of like, this is what this autonomous agent
Yeah.
art should do.
Yeah, I would definitely place it in this tradition, and Primavera's project was a big inspiration. She actually did it on Bitcoin, believe it or not, even even
Oh
even
God.
before back in the day. Eventually, it was on Bitcoin. Now it's on Ethereum.
Yeah.
But yeah, in some ways, the idea of making an autonomous agent is certainly not new at all. It's like something that you. I mean, I use mechanical duck sometimes as an avatar on Discord, and that's a reference to the digesting duck that was made by Jean Wilkinson. I might be butchering the name of the person who made it, but people have been since antiquity. This is like the 1600s. Trying to make automatons that can demonstrate that they are separate entities, that they're not controlled by human beings, but it's a lot more aspirational than because it's how do you actually do that. Another project that was a big inspiration is Aaron, which was made by Harold Cohen, who died just a few years ago. He worked for like 20 years, 20, 30 years, I don't know, basically trying to mechanize his process making he was an early using plotters to make large scale robotic drawings, and he tried to make a program that would basically paint kind of in his style. And so there's kind of this tradition in computer arts, that's interested in making these entities that are creative in some sense, and can make, and typically using AI and to some degree to give it this automation aspect, because that's really important to it. And then more recently, I was also inspired by a lot of ideas from the space of DAOs, especially kind of early DAO writing, when the A was more emphasized. Nowadays I think DAO just sort of means like a collection of people on that are kind of
DSCIT stands
united
for
for crypto.
Discord. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. Um, but um, but DAOs were super interesting. Art DAOs, for example, was a big influence on the idea, and that kind of gave me the idea of how to really get this autonomous aspect to it. And not just that, there was also been a lot of interesting work. I follow machine learning primarily, and in machine learning, there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's a particular subset of machine learning that's interested in kind of decentralizing aspects of the machine learning process, decentralizing, for example, data collection, decentralizing even the compute, like the training and the inference of models. And all of those things can help you make more decentralized systems. And then to me, like, what DAOs really show is the connection between decentralization and autonomy. And so I kind of view decentralization as a means of making something autonomous, as a means of getting it away from my own control. And that's the only way that I feel like it could qualify as its own agent, because as inspiring as something like Aaron was to me, Harold Cohen's Aaron, it was really it was Harold Cohen. Like I kind of think Aaron is like Harold Cohen is kind of like a ventriloquist, and Aaron is the dummy. You're kind of speaking through the agent. And I think, if there's some way that we could distribute this process, crowdsource it, and then it starts to surprise me. Like, I can't really predict what it's going to make, and then it starts to feel like a separate entity to me. And so that's kind of, to go back to the original question, that's basically the real, like, 30 to 50 year aim of Abraham. And right now we're not even close, like, I would say. So,
Doesn't
just
it do
text to image as a service. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and I think that, well, A, it's cool to hear about. I love just like, I just Googled Harold Cohen, and I'm excited to look at Aaron. And I think that I think, yeah, I feel like, yeah, we're not that. I guess like the version of it now, in some ways, it is an autonomous artist in that it's just doing text. It's a text to image as a service, which is kind of like art. It's kind of like telling you can imagine it as like an artist who's a really hard worker who you come to and you say, hey, make this art, make this art, make this art. And it's doing a good job of that. But I guess is the thing that would make it more autonomous is for it to self-generate the text ideas, or what would make it more autonomous?
Yeah, it's a large design space. So that's
Yeah.
one way of doing it, would that you would mechanize the process of coming up with the text inputs, and that's probably a step in that direction. One like I've always been interested in kind of like using collective human intelligence as a vehicle towards it is a form of automation, in the sense that again, it's like it becomes like, if I could take many people and use their inputs to kind of steer or guide this artist, so that it's not just my influence, then to me there's kind of I kind of compare it to like the hive mind, the idea of hive mind or collective intelligences. There is some cultural kind of acceptance of the idea that there is this emergent mind that you get from a group of aligned agents that are all sort of like, working together in a way. And so I'm kind of interested also in systems that use a lot of human input, basically.
Yeah.
But and
Cool.
of course, like, using another AI that's trained on text inputs to generate more text inputs is certainly a form of that. And so yeah, that's definitely, it's a large design space, and I'm hoping to kind of like, well, create some some infrastructure so that we can actually experiment with all of them, and kind of see what works.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
I think one thing that makes me think it was just like I love chatting with folks who are at the edge of new design spaces. I'm thinking about the folks, Josh Bongard and Michael Levin, who are creating the Institute for Computationally Designed Organisms. And they talk about morphology space. And it's just like, yeah, they created this little Xenobot, which is the first little thing of like this massive design space that's going to happen. And what you're talking about is like, hey, there's these huge design spaces of anything can be on the left side, any kind of input. It can be text, it can be speech, it can be whatever. It can be these collective, and it can be the collective intelligence where you just take a bunch of Twitter word clouds and put it in, or it can be an AI train on those things that then creates text inputs thing. And then there's a bunch of outputs. The outputs can be art. The outputs can be music. The outputs can be, digital audio, stuff for like specific workers, professionals. And so just like seeing these new spaces emerge is something that I'm really interested in. Do you think
Totally.
so thinking about, I guess, the specifics of like, I guess I'm curious for your take on like what you think about the future of AI assistance more generally, and maybe you're coming from like your AI art lens, but maybe kind of expanding the scope a bit and saying, okay, we know we have GitHub Copilot, and there's been some like Figma things that can create designs mocks, and then we also have obviously the whole world of chess and like these centaur people who are both, there's the chess side that they play, but there's also these kids who are born and raised with AI helping them. So tell me how you think about the future of AI assistants and or centaurs.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously there's a ton of interest in it. So for one thing, it's actually a lot older than we really think, and in a lot of ways, computers already are AI assistants. AI just used to basically mean computers if you go back to the 1950s, and there's this kind of joke that AI just means anything that computers can't do yet. So, computers are assistive objects, and so this just represents like continual sophistication and kind of, climbing the stack of like, going up tiers of complexity. And I think that will certainly continue. And I think one thing that makes this time unique is that it does feel like it's beginning to feel like relatable to people. Like, it was a very academic thing for a long time, but now there are actually products that people are beginning to experiment with. And I think, just to be even level headed, I feel like those products still are still kind of more novelty, and they there is a curve, there's a learning curve, and there's kind of, there'll take time for them to become, kind of like really part of the economy. But absolutely, I think that assistive AI is will just continue to grow, and you're seeing it a lot in, mostly in sort of these media applications, in all of the applications you mentioned. There's kind of, it's like a production of different kinds of media, and so probably, probably it'll, yeah, I just kind of see it growing in the meanwhile.
Yeah. And do you think, and it is cool to, as a reminder of like, yeah, compute. I'm reminded of that fun image from, I forget, or it's like a little video where it shows here's what a desk looked like before a computer, and you had your filing cabinet, and you had the calendar, and you had all these things, and then they all like became apps that then went into the computer, and so there is some kind of
Yeah.
like externalized. Yeah, it's like being able to. It's a way to help us assist us in all these ways. It's not just AI, but like computers obviously are amazing for this. Do you think I want to push on that a bit though, which is like, I guess, do you think, I don't know, like the future, I mean, are there going to be jobs of like people who are going to be AI inputters, or are there going to be, do we as people need to learn how to be centaurs in better ways? And like, I don't know. I guess I'm still curious for your kind of like, yeah, how will this look? What will it look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of what makes them really valuable now is that they make things on computers easier, so if you, like, for example, I can barely use Photoshop. It's not because Photoshop is necessarily that complicated, but there is a training process, and it's a little bit, you have to learn what all the buttons do, and it's a little bit unintuitive. And then in the future, that just gets replaced by natural language interface, which is something that people are really, really good at. And so in a way, this just makes the interface a lot more intuitive, and it just narrows this gap where you previously needed certain kinds of skills in order to get the computer to do something, and now this just kind of begins to edge away at that, so that really all you need is kind of like imagination and a little bit of interface. I think people tend the first applications tend to be of new technologies tend to be very like skeuomorphic. That's a word that I became familiar with recently. It's kind of the idea that you well, okay, so like, computers, they take filing cabinets and they make that into an app. And so we use kind of these legacy ideas to get ourselves familiar with the new technology. But the new technology really takes off when you start to create new things that are very much native to the technology itself, like things that you couldn't do before. It's not just, this plus AI, but it's just a completely new thing. So for me, like when I look at, for example, production of art assets, like visual art and music. I think where that starts to become interesting is I mean the core thing isn't that we can create music suddenly. It's like, of course, we've been able to make music forever, and the music that AIs make isn't better than the music that humans make. But the difference is that you can, whereas it used to take a musician, a whole bunch of time and energy and calories and sleep and everything in order to produce pieces of music, you can do it really cheaply on the fly, and so now you can just create more and more music. Now, so there's a funny thing where what is that good for exactly? Like if you, if it's not like we have any more time to consume music than we used to, so what's the good of having more of it? I think the good of it, or at least I shouldn't say the good of it, but just kind of like to be neutral, like what are the applications that I see kind of gravitating towards, taking advantage of this is things that kind of like are more customized, are more kind of serendipitous, like made for the moment, for a specific scenario, for a specific person at a specific time. Maybe in the future, a lot of the music we consume is made on the spot, basically, and there's kind of so things like that. I bet are kind of where I could see the technology really uh, making fundamentally new things.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, a lot of cool things in there. The first is I like this idea of, yeah, we're just like, and I like what your breakdown, like there's human creativity on one side, and then there's the interface, and then there's the output. And so like the interfaces have been hard in the past, like drawing with freaking like watercolors or oil paint, like, oh my God. And then we got Photoshop, which is still like, you click on the top and there's too many buttons, way too many buttons. And so in the
Right.
future, you can type it, you can say it, and then obviously in the future it'll just like kind of get sucked out of our brains, and so
Yeah.
that is, I think that progression is true and cool. And I think I also agree with your, yeah, the skeuomorphic versus like medium native. I wish we had a term for like anti-skeuomorphic or whatever, where it's like this is the medium that is built in, this is native and optimized for that medium. And it makes me think of, there's a specific video that I watched recently, which was a music video that did GAN generation for the lyrics. So all the lyrics were input to the video, and so it was like a video that was actually, it was a music video created by AIs based off of the lyrics, and it just actually, it was like a fundamentally new thing that was really cool. And so it also makes me, and I also agree with your thing of like this, like just like what this will look like is these like just in time things or whatever. It's like, oh, boom, hyper personalized, hyper in the moment. This is the exact music you want, and it's for the specific thing or whatever. Boom, you can create it because the friction is low enough. So I want to actually transition to chatting a little bit about this, like what information wants thing, and so to kind of give you and the listeners a bit more on what the deal is here. So it's a book that I'm writing. It's like a big history book, from the Big Bang through now. It thinks about how information evolves, and first it looks at like and especially from replicator. So we have genes that replicate to make the tree of life. They made all of this crazy, they evolved into these environmental niches, birds in the sky and fish in the water. And then we have memes, these ideas that we can share from mind to mind, not just internet memes, but like Dawkins memes, that then evolved into all these other niches and created the tree. Humanity, covered the earth. We have the tree of technology and the tree of ideas, both religions and also factories and all these things. And so that is true and it's happening. But there's, I think, and I'm not sure, and this is where I want your advice or thoughts, is like, there might also be this like new third replicator, which is like these AI based, I might call them like kemes, like these computer memes. Um, and there's like this fundamentally new substrate, which is zeros and ones, and like fundamentally new kind of computation mechanisms that provide new like creativity and experimentation, and that then is starting to evolve into its own kind of niches that are both kind of the same as what memes would evolve into, like the same like idea of a painting is kind of competing with the same like painting from a computer artist, but there might also be some like new fundamental ways that it's actually evolving into new niches. So I guess tell me what do you think about that? Do you think these like new computer memes, are they real, these kemes? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I guess like the way, well, so the again, I try to go back to fundamentals and think about what's different between the kind of information that's being produced by these things as opposed to, prior information. In one sense, is like the biggest thing is abundance. That it can be like hyper specific, hyper personalized, and so I guess what information wants, in the sense like the selfish gene, the selfish meme, it wants to replicate, it wants to kind of spread. And so, and there's funny thing is that, I'm kind of thinking about this on the fly because it's something I haven't considered too much, but I would say,
You're great. Yeah,
there's a tension a little bit between hyper sort of hyper specificity and replication, because, in a way that's like, it's like, does everyone see a different thing, or is there some kind of, like, are we all in the version of the world that I was just talking about? It's like almost everyone is watching their own TV shows just for them, and so then it, in a sense, like the information is disposed of. It doesn't actually replicate, and so I guess, if information wants to replicate, there needs to be some mechanism that does replicate it. And I suppose, there's something very, it's got to be a social mechanism, because why would we all watch the same TV show when we can watch a separate one? It's because, humans want to relate to each other, or use information to kind of, agree, like, well, to share a particular culture, to learn, to kind of, understand the norms of society through them, as an example or something. But
I love that. No, I
so
think
so yeah.
no, I
Oh
think
yeah,
that's
go
great.
ahead.
I think that like thinking of it, um, I think that what you're hitting at is super true, which is, and I'm just at the beginning, by the way, I like chatting with more AI folks about this. So just like, so yeah, we're co sharing this space. I think that the hyper abundance versus the like, it's like, okay, you have this hyper specific thing where it's like, I can essentially get a perfect Dall-E thing that I want, or a perfect little like music that I want, and I have it now, but then nobody else has it. But the cost of, because in the past, the weird thing is that it was easy for like genes to be like, oh, this organism worked in the water. Let's just make another fish because it seemed to work last time. So just like, let's roll it back. Let's do the same thing. But now it's like, and I agree with what you're saying, which is like the thing that might replicate, there might be some desires for like mutual intelligibility, because like we do have those desires like culturally. I also wonder if the thing that might be replicating is like the thing that generates the kind of, because you can think about those environmental niches, and then the thing that's like winning is like transformers or something, that like that new architecture is the thing that's actually going to replicate and succeed, because it is like powerful at evolving into those niches. So, and I guess I wonder, maybe a question for you here is, thinking specifically and almost like mechanistically or computer sciencely about the just like these new like architectures and something like, and I'm a computer science guy, but don't know, I and know some about transformers, but not deeply. How do you think about like, if you think about at the like computational level, and like, you have the encoding into like the latent or whatever, and then you have the like the decoding of the thing, and like, how do you think about like what are the like inevitable like forms maybe that might result at like the transformer level itself?
Can you clarify, like, for what sort of forms? What do you mean by forms?
Yeah, I guess what I mean is like, is there going to be um yeah, what's the way that I want to ask this? I guess like, if you imagine, there is, so we had a bunch of different, um yeah, I guess the easiest way to ask is something like, and or maybe from a generative adversarial network perspective, it's like, is there going to be like a, like, we can think of environmental niches from a higher level of abstraction, which is like what the humans want. and we can say, oh, the humans want nice art. Okay, great. It creates nice art. But then there's also a niche that might exist at a lower level of abstraction, at like the computational level, or it's like, are there other niches that AIs are likely to evolve into?
Hmm. Well, I guess like to talking about different kinds of architectures, neural networks to me, I think even though the analogy between them and brains is maybe uh, obviously it's like it's a little bit it's not exactly analogous, but I like to think of them a little bit that they're sort of like mechanistic versions of brains that can be duplicated and kind of hosted in different places, and we're creating a lot of these very large models which are being not only kind of deployed in various places, but they're also kind of feeding smaller networks downstream. Like one of the things that will probably happen in on the engineering side as the technology evolves, like we're building these extremely large neural networks that are very difficult to they're intrinsically kind of centralizing. You need a lot of resources to run them, and so for the sake of being pragmatic and being able to serve applications downstream. They're kind of called foundation models. To some people have
Hmm.
started using that as a nickname. They're these very large, Dall-E and GPT-3, extremely. They're foundational, but you can kind of modularize them to a degree where you use the big models to kind of feed smaller models downstream that are maybe more application specific, or the criteria, or what they're trying to accomplish is more use case specific. And so I kind of see that coming. And maybe they feed other networks that are smaller and more manageable. You can run them locally, for example. And so I don't know if that really
That's
answers
great.
the
No.
question, but
Yeah, no, no. I think I mean, that's super connect, which is like it's almost like, because you can imagine it's just like information is pattern. And so, like, one of the informational patterns that is going to emerge is just like, hey, you take these Dall-E models, which is like, and I'm not sure exactly how Dall-E and these other huge models work, but it's kind of like, feed me all of the internet, kind of, or whatever. And then, and then let's make a model, AKA, a thing that takes so feed me all the internet, and then when you feed me all of the internet, what you have is a like this model that takes these, and I don't totally get this, but it takes these inputs on one side and it creates these is the model a does it have like, it has, hey, if you give it a certain set of words, then it has like the main thing that it contains is some kind of like a conceptual latent of how that model like looks like an n-dimensional vector. Is that primarily what it is?
not all models work exactly like that. Like,
Okay.
so generative adversarial networks, you that's a pretty decent analogy, that there's this kind of this latent space. But then, for example, like the things like Dall-E they're not using GANs, they're using Dall-E and Imagen, they're using diffusion models, which don't really exactly have quite the same interpretation like of a latent space. They work slightly different. It's not that you can't. There's definitely some parallel analogy that they do have this kind of, you could say that they have some kind of a high level understanding, that they've sort of vectorized all of the information, and then they have these kind of high level conceptions that emerge from that. But that it doesn't necessarily that you don't have like a single latent vector, for example, in those. So it's but it's for at least for GANs and actually like transformers, you could make the case too that they basically have something like that. They're encoder decoder systems. So you have
Yeah.
this you have this kind of conceptual space. That conceptual space can be periodically updated with new information. One thing I keep thinking about is what happens when you start to feed in the information that these kinds of systems produce. Like if the internet becomes more and more full of AI generated content, does that become the training data as well? And then it just kind of gets away from human beings altogether, but which is a really funny, or I mean, I shouldn't say funny. It's like maybe even terrifying, but a scenario that is worth contemplating.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think there's a couple. I mean, a it and what I think I've learned from this is like a good way for me to start these like AI conversations with people is like to be like, hey, tell me in your words like how something like a GAN works, so that we can just start to be using the same language. And then, but I think a lot of the things that you said are really interesting there, which is that yeah, lots of these models have a similar thing, which is they take some kind of tons of information training data and then they turn it into some kind of latent space or vectorized kind of conceptual space, and then it kind of gets updated over time with like its concepts of like how the world works, like given this what will happen, or given this what is the like concept. And as you said, yeah, I super agree that there is, and people talk about it as like one of the feedback loops that drove some like MAGA Trump stuff, which is that AI bots were kind of shifting the Overton window with really aggressive, like, oh, what about, oh, so much immigration, so intense or whatever. And then but they were saying things that were more aggressive. And then that then allowed the people to not be that aggressive, but to still, the Overton window was shifting. And so they started to say more stuff like keep everybody out or whatever it may have been, build a wall, which would have been less okay in the past. But like the bots shifted the Overton window, and then the bots could kind of like continue to shift it further. So yeah, that will, yeah, well, hopefully it won't be too intense, but excited for that. As a final wrap moment, I guess I want to know, yeah, I mean, I guess that the primary, I guess a couple things. One is, do you think, I do want to ask a lightning round of overrated and underrated. And so
Okay.
you just 30 seconds of whether you think the thing is overrated or underrated. And I guess the first
Okay.
thing is just Dall-E. Do you think Dall-E is overrated or underrated?
It depends on which dimension, but overrated. Because like, do I get to answer these, or do I just
Yes,
say
you get
overrated,
to say,
underrated?
yeah, yeah, and why?
Oh,
Yep.
oh yeah. I think overrated. Okay, well, yeah, this is a tricky one. I think overrated for me. It's overrated because I want sovereignty. And so I think like there is a little bit of a tension with the the permission and open permission closed view of the world that I feel like OpenAI is, at least for now, going for, ironically enough, and so overrated.
I love that. And I love the version of things. It's like it could be called, why not call it closed AI? More like closed AI,
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit
Um,
of a running joke by now.
oh, I didn't even know that. That's hilarious. I'm glad that joke exists. And then the other, do you think GANs are overrated or underrated?
They're probably overrated just because they stole all the spotlight for a few years, and they were very much, most of the advances were kind of GAN oriented, but now people use GANs as a stand-in for all kinds of generative models, even though now there's different kinds of generative models which are not GANs anymore, and they're very much competitive with them: transformers, diffusion models, flow models, all this kind of stuff. But it's kind of like Band-Aid is what you say. Band-Aid was a brand name for bandages, and everyone, it's like Kleenex and things like that. I think you think with GANs, you see that now.
I love it. Yeah.
But
And you said,
not that their GANs are still amazing, but
and you said
there's
there's GANs and then there's diffusion models. And what was the other one that you said? Just top of
there's
mind?
like flow models. There's different categories. There's the autoregressive models. There's LSTMs and RNN.
Uh-huh.
There's a whole family
Yeah.
of
Oh yeah.
generative
Oh yeah.
models. Yeah.
Great. Well, Gene, so thank you so much. So we're at time now, but I think, thank you it's cool to hear just, yeah, I mean, this pushing the bounds of what art means in this kind of digital, computerized, hyper networked collective intelligence age. I think that's really awesome. And so for folks, if you want to learn more about Gene, he has a great Twitter. So go to Gene Kogan. That's GeneKogan again. Gene Kogan on Twitter. Also, check out, he has a lot of cool. You can join this Abraham AI community if you're looking to experiment with these kind of autonomous AI agents and these text to image models. And he also has a bunch of other cool things like a ML for all vibe of like
Yep.
machine learning for artists. So if you're an artist that wants to learn more about that, check that out. Or this like really weird thing called Mars College, which is like a community that joins in the desert like once a year and like hacks on stuff. So anything else you want to say, Gene, to our listeners?
Yeah, if you're interested in any of that, I'm on Twitter and Discord, and I'm happy to hear from people. I have all these things that I hope kind of reach people and are, broadly useful to them. So if any of it is interesting to you, then please, reach out to me.
Beautiful. That sounds great. Yep. Slide into his DMs. Always open. And thank you so much, Gene, for coming. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you liked the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.